Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode or show, should I say, of the Doctor's Lab with Dr. Khalid Green and myself, Abdul Haqq. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Khalid.
Wa alaikum salam rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hayyakum Allah.
How are you today, my brother?
Alhamdulillah, I'm okay. Trying to move forward. So much to talk about, so much to do.
No, a lot to do today. I think it's very interesting. As you know, we're going to be talking about France as a case study, Paris, the recent Paris attack. And we're talking about extremism, the two faces of extremism as we look at Paris and France. And I think that what's really important on this occasion, we've been speaking about our PhD studies and looking at academic perspectives that talk about Salafiyya, orthodoxy in Islam. And the last few episodes, we spoke about the liberal extremism, as I term.
Your audio went out.
Can you hear me?
Okay, now you're back on.
Yeah. So we spoke about your PhD. We were speaking about progressiveness. Now, when we're talking about liberal extremism and we're talking about progressiveness, what I did in my PhD, I didn't only confine it to Muslim liberalism. I spoke about it societally. And I just want to say a quick assalamu alaikum to our brothers and sisters who have joined us, and some of you have been waiting patiently. And I know that we've got a wider audience there. Wa alaikum salam, brother Baju, I think it is. So I think we've got a wider audience, and you're all welcome. Now, so Khalid, coming back to this point. So when you spoke about progressiveness, did you restrict it to progressiveness amongst Muslims, or did you look at it from a societal perspective as well? So on a microcosmic level and on a macro level, like I did?
Yeah, I did, because that wasn't the crux of my PhD, I did look at it in both ways. I looked at it from, I guess you could say, a sectarian perspective, and then a societal perspective. And I actually did use France as my only real case study, you know, and a little bit from your research as far as the UK, you know, but
excellent.
More, yeah.
Thank you. And wa alaikum salam, Queen of Jordan, and Floating Man salams. What we do, Khalid, I know some of these brothers and sisters from the previous show, so you'll see me giving them a shout out, and you're welcome to as well. They join us often, mashallah, tabarakallah. So that's, I remember you saying that you had looked at France. So this is very pertinent in what we're looking at now. The last few shows, as I said, we spoke about liberalism, and we gave examples of that within the Muslim community. Now I think we should widen it on the macro level. And one of the things I want to talk about is that look at what's happened since this attack and this beheading of this teacher last week. Let's look at the state and statutory response. And I am going to speak I will speak directly to this point. Very few are willing to talk about state legislated terrorism. Okay, when it comes from a Western governmental perspective, they call it fights against extremism, war on terror, and the like. But in actuality, when we look at it in its crude definition of the term, it is state legislated terrorism, basically. Wa alaikum salam, Sister Sabrina. So now, what we've got to look at is that both extremes feed on each other. Okay, we remember, and if Hassan, I've asked him to reproduce some of the frameworks I put in, and if you can do the continuum one, Khalid, from the liberal extreme to the violent extreme. We spoke about this, and this is what we will be looking at with the scenario in Paris at the moment. You've got the terrorist attack that took place, the beheading of this teacher. Then if we want to look at another case in point, not as severe, wa alaikum salam para, what we saw is this attack on two French Muslim, or more than two. It was a set of sisters, 5 sisters and 4 of their children, or 4 sisters and 5 children. And basically they were out in Paris, and some dogs of 2 women were walking with their dogs, and the dogs were unleashed and were acting uncontrollably. The children became afraid. The Muslim mothers asked, "Can you tether your dogs?" And then they were met with abuse from these non-Muslim women, telling them to go back to their country and everything like that, and getting really aggressive in their manner. Now, there was some confrontation of sorts from what is understood. And then the next thing you knew, one of the Muslim women got stabbed in her face, okay? And the other one suffered, one of the other sisters suffered multiple stab wounds and is still in hospital now. Why am I speaking to this point now? While they were saying go back to your own country, even though they're French, you dirty Arabs, and these slanderous and offensive epithets that were being mentioned, the reporting is very interesting. When they went to the police, they said initially, it's in the press, that this was nothing to do with Islamophobia, that this was something to do with a dispute over a dog. Okay, that's what they said initially. They've since changed that and said that it was race related. They're saying it was an assault, but it was more like attempted murder, and it's just been played down. It's been minimized, continuous, and we see this with any issue to do with Muslim assaults, Muslim attacks, and everything. You only have to juxtapose that when we look at, for example, when we see anti-Zionist and racist graffiti sprayed on Jewish graves, and the furore that's caused around that. And I'm not saying anything to denigrate the Jewish faith. I'm just putting them as an example where when it comes to Islamophobia, it's one thing. When anything that is even remotely or sniffs of anti-Semitism is broadcast in this particular instance. And that speaks to the liberal, extreme framework, paradigm that we are living in within a Western context. Before I continue, I want to hear what your feedback is on your own perspective, please.
Yeah, there's nothing I could say except really concur with what you said, except for I'm not exactly sure why at the end you said the liberal framework, because I just feel that really that paradigm, that reactiveness and that racial onslaught in essence will come from both angles. For example, in the US, we also have a similar in the West in general, but in the US, because we're a particularly violent society, we have guns and so forth. We've had all kind of scenarios, especially since the president came in office and his polarization. And really a lot of the elements that we face were not on the political perspective, from the liberals per se. But it's more from the right wing, people rolling up with guns and threatening sisters. For minorities in general, it has been kind of tragic. We've had a man who was just jogging through the neighborhood, and he was hunted. Really, they hunted him, and one of the guys, I think, was an ex-police officer, and they shot him and killed him. So we have these kind of scenarios from more from the right wing. Whereas the liberals will maybe, I've seen signs in some of the masajid that are more open, we love you, our Muslim neighbors, and all this other stuff. And, they have these luncheons and things like this. So I think as far as the violent aspect, it's usually coming from that angle.
Jazakallah khair. I will rewind back on that then and correct that statement, because you're right. When it's not a liberal extreme perspective, it's not confined to that. I think, but what I'm speaking about, I'll clarify what I mean. From a societal perspective, I mean legislated drive. It is. I believe it is. Okay, because that's where the preponderance is. And Jordan said earlier on, salams, Jordan, and that you love us, and for you say you love us, may he love you also. Thank you for that. So my thing now is, let's look at France in that instance. France and its legislation against Muslims. It has the largest Muslim minority in Europe, and we know about France's pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial agenda and the destruction that they wrought in Algeria and other places over the years. And we look at just what the French Muslims are facing regularly there. We know that the niqab, assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum salam, Sister Kira. We see that the niqab has been outlawed in that particular instance because they see it as quote unquote behaviorally extreme, according to my terminology in that instance. However, what we see is a dilution of anything that is a grievance from the Muslim communities. And we see a heavy-handedness. We've seen mosques have been closed very recently. We've seen how integrated or embedded particular Muslim communities are amongst each other. And it's unfortunate because that element of radicalization, or that element of let's say susceptibility to radicalization, exists at a very, very rudimentary level amongst minorities. Why do I say that? We see that fathers had complained about this teacher and what he was doing when they heard that he was going to be raising this subject on the caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We hear the description of students being paid and pointing out who the individual was. We see there was talk on social media. So this is why there's so many arrests taking place at the moment. Now, in that case, that can't be argued against, because the legislature is going to do what it has to do to pinpoint and highlight the perpetrators or those who tacitly supported that. That's understandable. And I'm not speaking about that in itself. I'm speaking about the heavy-handedness that then is cast over the rest of the Muslim community, which is a targeted community in itself. And by doing that, that perpetuates a cycle. It perpetuates a cycle from a response to that liberal attack that is upon social conservatism amongst Muslims. I'm not talking about extreme Muslims now. I'm talking about social conservative Muslims, which is the majority, which are the majority of Muslims in itself anyway. So speak to that for me, if you don't mind.
Wow, you just unpacked so much, mashallah, tabarakallah. There was a sister who just made a comment, which I think is also very relevant. As she said, the stabbing of the French sisters will not be condemned, as they are consistent with the government position and narrative. It will always be defended. So as you mentioned, that especially France, and that's one of the reasons why I looked at France in my research, because unlike the UK, unlike America and some of the other European societies, some of them, they tafawut. They have different levels of and different ideas about what liberalism is, okay? Or the French policy of, I guess, I know I'm going to kill the pronunciation, laissez-faire or something like this, that they're, even in their colonial administrations, as you mentioned, Algeria and so forth, what was the French policy? The French policy, when they colonized Africa and Muslim states and Asian states and what have you, was assimilation. They came in, they set up an administration. Oftentimes they were very brutal. They wanted, as one of the, it might have been Sartre or one of these French philosophers, and I quoted that, I think, in my master's thesis, and he said the goal of the French colonial system was to produce little brown Frenchmen. And so he mentioned that, and you really see that. So that is really reflected in the French policy at home. For them, it's a big part of assimilation. I listened to one of the foreign ministers the other day, and I was just shocked. I wanted to record it because what he said, because the BBC reporter, I think it was BBC, and he said, so are you saying that people can't, have a love for God more than the state? He said, no, they shouldn't. It should be the state first and then God. It was very open. Their whole policy, they are so much, they're very much into assimilation. And as you said, this breeds, because when you strip people totally of their identity and you ostracize them, and at the same time you don't provide for them, they're marginalized and so forth. As we know, those are some of the causes of radicalism. So sorry to kind of go all the way around, but absolutely. I was trying to cover quite a few things there. And so we see the problems, and I just want to end this point with what I'm going to say right now. This is why you have such a push. A place like France, honestly, and again, that's for the scholars to really address and study, but it seems to me clear, a place like France, Belgium, and some of those states that are very aggressively secularist and don't even give you the right, their rights are very limited, but assimilation and French identity and French values comes first. Those kind of states really Muslims should not live there. They should be making the hijrah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Because it's no way, they're never going to back from that policy. That is who they are. That's intrinsically, as Macron and those people are coming out with their chest up, like, hey, this is who we are. So this gives him the chance now to really crack down on the whole population, put fear. We're going to defund your organizations. We're going to scrutinize everyone. We're going to, you better become French people, and you better quit wanting to homeschool. You should dress the same, eat the same, look the same, be French people, of what their image of Frenchness. And this, how is a Muslim going to really exist in that, to practice Islam? You're just going to relegate it to the bait, to your house only. No hijab, no speaking out, no nothing. It's a travesty, but it's kind of a wake up call. And I think
it's very important what you said, and I'm really pleased to see, subhanAllah, that the audience are so engaged. I've seen some amazing comments that are coming up there that basically it's terrorism masquerading as freedom of speech. Since the Crusades, one of the sisters is saying that France has had this crusade, continued its crusade against the Muslims in that instance as well. And I think that I'm just going to read what Sister Amelia is saying. Imams and sheikhs must educate our Muslim youth and teach them the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, and it's not okay to kill others. That's not how you defend the Prophet. Absolutely. And I spoke about this in the previous Baker broadcast earlier this week. But what I want to do now, Khalid, as we're going to be talking about these two faces of extremism, I want to talk about what I did in my PhD, and I'll refer to it and come back to some aspects there. So I developed a perceptions of injustice continuum. Wa alaikum salam, KA. And I said that there's that sense of injustice, that you believe we're being persecuted, but then there's that actual but conceivable injustice. What's an example of that? The stop and search that was implemented against Muslims, and that targeting of Muslims in that particular instance. Wa alaikum salam, Sister Sarah. And then you've got the ultimate injustice, where we see what you're talking about, that actual targeting and that securitization amongst the Muslims. But then I mentioned here, this simple continuum served to reflect the extent of Muslim sentiment in the light of perceived injustices implemented by the government and statutory agencies against the religion of Islam, Muslim countries, or the Muslims themselves. I said the researcher submits that this continuum can be used when considering the case studies to determine each subject's perception of external, socio-political, or socio-religious factors that push them towards violent extremism, that propel them towards violent extremism. And then I highlighted a more comprehensive framework, which I adapted. And Hassan, if you can put up the cycle of violence framework for me, please, if that can be displayed for our viewers to see that when he's ready. So Hassan, if you're there, can you put that up, please? I'm not sure if you get that's the funnel one. It's no, next one. There's two more. Next one after that. This one. This cycle of violence, you can see when how it moves. You've got the debates, demonstrations, rallies. You move around to where those who are disillusioned and disengaged from those rallies, they don't believe in the democratic process anymore because it's not serving what they feel it should serve. So let's talk, for example, Muslims protesting against the depiction of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in the cartoons. Put it up again, please, Hassan. I'll tell you when to take it down. So then what you'll see is that they saw that was of no use. Okay. So then some went, over the years, we've seen some went and implemented atrocities in that instance. You'll see that following on from that, there still may be anger, frustration, and bitterness, and some seeking revenge and retaliation. Then you'll see that there's the suicide bombings against one's own society. And that goes round. Those deep blue lines that I've put down the middle, some are circumvented and go straight to this. They're disillusioned, they go straight to revenge and retaliation. An atrocity is committed, others will come, whether it's societally or from a faith group who want to enact revenge and retaliation. But this cycle of violence model, it perpetuates itself. And Hassan, if you can take that down, please, and put up the second to last one that you did, which shows the 3 sections of liberalism. This one. So we see on this side, I highlighted this before, Khalid. You'll see that, for example, the liberalism that's there and there's a pendulum swing from liberalism across to the fanatical extreme, with some Muslims who are disillusioned with a very liberal, sanitized approach of some Muslims to issues like the caricature of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, like some of the draconian laws that are being placed on Muslim communities. So they then end up swinging across to the fanatical extreme. It's very rare that you see a fanatical extreme go back across to liberalism, unless it's these born-again groups or these individuals who say that they're no longer extreme and they've gone towards liberalism. If you can take that down for me, please, now, Hassan. Thank you very much for that. So this is what we're looking at now. We're looking at two sides of the same coin, where France is driving, like you said, that very aggressive liberty, egalitarian, whatever it is that their things are. The three slogans they've got for their ethos, and then you've seen the anger of those to that, and the retaliation and the response, believing what they're doing is in the name of their faith.
I don't have anything to say on that. I mean, you articulated it very well, and with the charts and so forth. So, it is it's the nature and the characteristic of their state. As you said, it's aggressive. Here, this is a little quote that I had from my research here. Aside from pluralism, another challenge posed by Western democracies for Muslim minorities is secularism. Western democracies differ with regards to their policies towards religion, tolerance, and multiculturalism. One example of a Western democratic country that enforces an aggressive policy of assimilation is France. Assimilation is a key pillar of French democracy and political culture, as well as a part of its colonial legacy. And this is basically what we have said already. France is also staunchly secular, tolerating religion only in the private sphere, citing national cohesion as a more important objective than maintaining individual and religious identities. So they have these limited frameworks of their freedom, and as you mentioned, it's really it becomes a cycle. It becomes a cycle of this heavy-handedness from the state, and marginalization, and the other factors that contribute to that radicalization, pushing other individuals. I mean, now with this new heavy-handedness, there'll be those who submit into order. I've seen some of the French imams marching and putting flowers and saying, denouncing that, but not denouncing the fact that they have to assimilate, and others they'll come into line. But then there's going to be a large body of Muslims from all orientations and what have you, who will probably be a bit more radicalized or a bit more hostile towards those French values. And I mean, the minister was very open, saying, "Hey, get out if you don't want to. You don't want to play our game. Get out." That's
and on top. No, absolutely.
Yeah,
and before this all happened, we had Macron talking about there's a problem with Islam, and Jazakallah khair, Sister Shabnam, she's given me the phrase that the liberty, equality, fraternity, and that's their slogan. That's actually there. I would say, like we used to say back in the day, they're actually taking liberties, they're taking advantage. But also one of the Walaikum Salam, Brother Muhammad, one of them have said put up about shouldn't we be lobbying? And I would say to the viewer who's mentioned that, if the lobbying was being successful, if it was successful, then yes, continue to lobby. But what you'll see, that the lobbyists are usually of the liberal, progressive extreme, and they're lobbying in a manner and in a tone, a diluted tone, that the government finds palatable. Okay, they find that palatable, so that's why they can listen to them. Okay, if it was from orthodoxy, it would be shut down, be marginalized, as we saw organizations like mine were shut down for being socially conservative. We didn't shut down, but they withdrew funding when we was working in partnership initially with them, because we were socially orthodox, socially conservative in that instance. But I want to highlight this as well. When we look, for example, at this is for my PhD, the definition of atrocities in this instance is restricted to the general Muslim perception of injustice by some Western governments against Muslim countries. I'm going back to my cycle of violence now, or communities. And I mentioned that in the case studies that I would look at, it would reveal the extent of politicization among adherents to violent extremism. So let's look at what's Wa alaikum salam, Suri, good to see you here with us, joining us. Let's look at that. When we look at an individual decides, I'm going to go and teach a teacher a lesson. In fact, no, I'm not going to teach this teacher a lesson. I'm going to kill him. I'm going to go to the extent of decapitating him.
Right.
Let's go back to 2013 in the UK, in Southeast London, when we saw two individuals, Michael Adebolawi and Michael Adebolajo, look for a soldier and start at their attempts, run him over on the street, and then they attempted to decapitate him as well. And they stood there. Michael Adebolajo stood there, knife in hand, in front of the people, and explained why he did what he did.
Yeah.
Waiting to get martyrdom. They had a fake gun, faulty gun, waiting for the police to come so that they could be shot dead. What were they doing? What was the mindset of these individuals to do this? What was the mindset of this Chechen national who went and said, I'm going to do this? The hatred that they had in their heart that someone could depict and then discuss the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in such a derogatory light, in a derogatory manner. But as one of the sisters said in this instance, this is not the way. This is not the way from the Sunnah. This is not the way to defend our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is not the way to defend Islam. However, we are living in a context or within an environment, in a French environment, where the toxic polarization from one side, which is from the state, is causing an equally toxic response at the ground root coming up.
Yeah.
And we only have to look back, go back 7 years, go back 5 years, look at the Charlie Hebdo, what happened on that occasion that shocked France. And it wasn't even a year that we saw later the Bataclan and that mass murder and wanton terrorism that unveiled itself or revealed itself in Paris 10 or so months later.
That's right.
So the French have got to ask themselves, with this drive for assimilation, and we will talk about assimilation because this is a very key thing that you mentioned there, with this drive for assimilation, it's only exacerbating the problem in the manner in which you are trying to using a sledgehammer to crack a nut with this particular problem. You don't see the extent of this in other societies. So this liberal extremism from a government legislative perspective is propelling and fueling the violent extremism from the religious perspective. And in the violent extremist perspective is fueling the state legislated liberal extremism and their perspective. There's no way this is going to dissipate as it stands at the moment now. So they've got to look at one thing. Should it be assimilation that they're discussing with the society, the citizens of society? Because assimilation means losing and eschewing all identity except French. Integration, on the other hand, is more negotiable. That there are some common identity markers that you can engage on, that you can accept without shunning fundamental aspects of your belief system, of your cultural backdrop. Because hey, after all, if we go back, let's go back with France. Let's go back centuries. They weren't always as they were now. They were conquered and invaded by others, just like the UK were, just like other, like we had the Visigoths, we had the Romans, we had the Vandals, so when they look at their actual composite structure that eventually made up France, everyone is an immigrant originally, no matter how many centuries or so ago you go. So assimilation is a false premise upon which to try and enforce citizens to subscribe to the values of any particular country. Integration is a softer, more negotiable one. I'm repeating myself now in this instance. So coming to it now, the two faces of extremism is assimilation, and that drive for assimilation and what it requires, the problem of this polarization of liberal extremism and violent extremism.
Yeah, I think as you said, that it is a driver. I do not believe they will relinquish those values at all and say, "Hey, let's move to another policy." And you can see that this has given them what can we say, that this has allowed for them to be able to pursue aggressively, even more aggressively, their policy. And I think assert it with a knife and gun, basically to say, hey, no way. Now we told you this is the problem of a lack of assimilation. If this young guy would have assimilated to our society and understand the value of being able to talk about everything sacred, and that is from freedom of expression, and that is all good, and that is the end good. That's the overall good. God is fourth, fifth, sixth down the pole. We don't even care if you have a God. We just care about this value is sacred. So I don't see that there will be any type of change. And I think it's going to embolden them to really crack down and say, hey, this is about French values and French nationalism. We have to smash these people. And I think it's going to get really, it already has initially, but it's only beginning, that it's going to get really tight for Muslims in France with a very harsh squeezing to come to the table. What's the reaction going to be? I think many people are not going to try to make hijrah. They're going to be squeezed. There will be large portions of people who will probably assimilate and go with the flow. And then there's going to be those pockets that are radicalized even more and say, hey, we told you, let's fight the state and others, let's go. This is it, so it is a mess, and it's this isn't just unique to France, but France is a liberal democracy or what have you, under this guise. But then you see the contradictions in their liberalism, in their supposed freedom of expression, freedom of religion. Instead, they want to still enforce certain values and an identity. But when we look at what happened in Sri Lanka, we look at, of course, China, we look at, all these other places, the Rohingya and others, and the way they're being oppressed around the world, often as Muslim minorities, and having to flee their country and flee everything they believe in because of that national identity. Look at India, as big as India is, and as many Muslims there is around the world, as many Muslims as there are around the world, that in India, that what's going on in India also, Modi, his government is going with Hindu nationalism hardcore, and
and this is important. You've made an important point there, Khalid, and I think that we have to ask this question. We see what's happening with the Uyghurs in China, and the Chinese are not admitting to it despite there being evidence there.
Yeah.
And then if you juxtapose that, place that beside what is happening in France, and France are just blatantly saying it. So to be honestly speaking, it wouldn't surprise me if France subscribed to what was happening with the Uyghurs in China as a policy, but because of their liberal democratic society, they can't openly subscribe to that. But they're doing so. It's a tacit endorsement with the language and the ideology that they're pushing and driving now. Now, I want to talk about, again, from a framework, what this looks like for our audience to see. And Hassan, if you can put up any of the two funnel frameworks, I'm going to discuss that and how that looks. This is a framework that I developed in my PhD, and it's the funnel model. Let's look at the top of that, where you'll see that any funnel, as everyone knows, when you put the water or the fluid or whatever in, the liquid in at the top, it's at its most malleable. There's no pressure there, okay? Anything goes there. Anything can go in at the top there. And that's what I highlighted as the liberal extreme and secular Muslim communities. And the reason I'm talking about these communities as well, because they can actually exacerbate the problem as it comes to liberalism, progressiveness, and this extremism societally that's being promoted societally. As you go down this particular funnel now, the gravitational pull towards extremism from those who want to move away from liberalism becomes stronger. So as you're being pulled down this, that disillusioned Muslim, seeing that they're believing and perceiving that their faith is being attacked, you see it being them going, gravitating downward, downward, downward. They move towards other Muslim communities. They see, okay, this one's conventional. It's maybe Muslim Brotherhood inclined, or it's Sufi inclined, but it's there. But they're still feeling that liberalism and that onslaught against their faith and identity markers being stripped or frowned upon, like the niqab and things like this. They move to the more socially conservative Salafi community, which is at the hard end, which is right at the neck, not extreme, but socially conservative. And therefore, at a very pivotal point of the funnel in knowing and understanding what extremism looks like, because they can combat it. And once that individual decides he doesn't want to be part of this particular community, it's not active enough, it's not reactionary enough, the gravitational pull right down from the neck downwards takes him or her towards that violent, fanatical extremism. And that's where the gravitational pull is strongest. And you get that cycle of violence enactment where they say, I've had enough of the liberal society that I'm in. I need to do some action. And if you don't mind, Hassan, putting that final framework, the cross-section of this is a cross-section of that same funnel where you'll see the wider society. And that's where you'll see the liberalism being at its most potent. And then again, if you come across, there's that vacuumous pull, that gravitational pull down the middle, where you'll see individuals moving away from wider society, away from mainstream Muslims, away from the Salafi orthodoxy of these communities, because they perceive that what is happening to them and their communities can only be countered with an extreme reaction. So they go down to that vacuumous pull towards extremists and extremism, and therefore enactments of terrorism. Please remove the framework now, please, Hassan, if you don't mind.
I was going to say, before you move that framework, I was just going to say, I think the initial part of the funnel now is kind of merging, meaning that now there's at the top where you have your wider host society, government, and statutory bodies. Okay, I think that mainstream Muslim community in many Western countries, and possibly other, and even some Muslim countries, is now beginning to merge because of the progressiveness.
Take that down, Hassan.
Not with the seller going. You know what I'm saying. So the model is always probably going to be somewhat in flux, depending on where the majority of the Muslims are. But I think there's a bit of a emerging, because now we see the progressives have really, these past few years, especially with the fall of ISIS, it has triggered a backlash to religious conservatism. You know, a lot of people just view it, hey, we told you the guys with the beards are bad. The guys with the short throats are bad. The sisters with
that's fantastic.
Are bad. We need to come out with the hijab, wear the long hair, the makeup. I'm going to do a YouTube video with it. It's going to be nice and pretty. And the brother's going to just shave off. You know, we have the most ridiculous and insane things going on, especially in the social media sphere, with the Muslims, husband and wife teams, doing videos out there. He's got his wife out there. Her hijab is slowly coming off. And, you know, this is becoming more mainstream. Whereas in the past, that would have been viewed a little bit more, you know, it would have been appalling. Another point I want to speak to, getting more back on the topic, as you mentioned, you and I both have known people personally who fell through went through those stages in the tunnel, you know, and through the whole funnel.
Yes.
They started out maybe progressive or what have you, or just a mainstream person who practiced or didn't practice. And then they went through stages, and the politics of world politics and things got to them, the position of the Muslims, you know, and all of those pushing, you know, those different movements pushing for the Caliphate, like Hizb ut-Tahrir and other groups like this, and the Muhajirun and other groups, you know, all of this, you know, along with the politics, the greater politics of what's going on in the Muslim world and so forth, push them. And with their ignorance, they slide into that extremism. And I can think of personal examples. I know someone right now who's responsible, and I'm not going to name names, anything like this, but I think he killed at least 4 people he's responsible for killing. They know him very well. You know what happened?
Khalid, yeah.
And then they moved.
You've said some key things then. One of the things, before I touched upon them, Reactionary highlighted something in actuality I think is very, very important. He said that what France has done in DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, is far worse already than what has happened in China with the Uyghurs. Jazakallah khair, Reactionary, for pointing that out. So they're already on that trajectory of not even assimilation, but basically destruction of anything that threatens their paradigm in that instance. So again, Brother Reactionary, Jazakallah khair for that intervention there. But what you've just said there, and this is why I like this doctor's lab and us coming together. No one has given me another paradigm before on any of my frameworks. And you've just said something which I'm going to start referring to. When you said about the merging of the outer framework, the wider society with the mainstream. Because what that in essence has done, it's made the gap in the middle wider because of what you said, pushing the socially conservative Salafi community, or the perceptions that they're closer to the center of the vacuumous pull and the gravitational pull in that instance, and therefore distorting the equilibria of this particular societal framework, and people having that distorted perception that the Salafi community are in actuality extreme. As we heard in 2010-11 from David Cameron in his Munich speech, non-violent extremists in that instance. So I'm really appreciative that you've brought that paradigm, and I think it could only be brought from someone who is from within such communities, looking at this from the same perspectives that we actually do. So Jazakallah khair, Aki, so literally they're merging in that sense, and that merging, as you said, that mainstream element are progressives distorting that boundary outwardly, as we were talking about the progressive last week. We'll talk about Quilliam Foundation, Majid Nawaz. We've got Yaqeen Institute. We've got brothers that we know are trying to advise the Yaqeen Institute in that instance. I don't think anyone's advising Quilliam. They're beyond any advice. They're so enamored with the attention they're getting from non-Muslim society, wider society, government, and other caucus groups like that. So this is a very, very important thing to look at, that when societal boundaries, when societal structures and apparatus between Muslims, wider society, any citizen and wider society starts being distorted by elements that are pushing for that distortion, then by default, it marginalizes others who were not previously seen as extreme. It pushes them under a radar in which they are left with no real choice in some circumstances, those who are not grounded, but to retaliate, but to react, and then the cycle continues. So I think that's Jazakallah khair, I think that's a really important reframing or review of a framework that I developed during my PhD.
I think, you know, as I say, we know these things, these are kind of fluid, they move, these, you know, and people move, you know, and politics and the spectrum itself moves. And again, look how many people we've seen and we've known personally who have moved through those things. I'm also reminded of, and I mentioned his name many times, Morton Storm. Okay, I knew him when he was a Salafi, when he was a new Muslim. Sheikh Muqbil bin Hadi al-Wa'di used to call his name, knew him personally better than a lot of other people there. He liked, the Sheikh loved him. You know, he loved Murad Denmarki, you know.
Right,
he was sincere at that stage, but look at his stages. When he left Damaj, when he got caught up with all kind of other individuals, he got more into the Ikhwan Muslimin fold and started moving with got with big, powerful Ikhwan Muslimin figureheads then that wasn't hardcore enough. And he even mentions in his book, Salafis were not hardcore enough. They were not doing anything about these problems.
Right.
They were not nothing, you know. So then, boom, he went to his next phase. And his next phase was running with the hardcore Takfiris. He was out, and then he was courted by the intelligence agencies, and you know, and went through his phases until he went out of the fold of Islam, and you know, worked directly with those agencies. So, you know, it's a fluid thing. You know, it's a fluid process that, you know.
He mentioned in his book, speaking to that point you mentioned, he mentioned in his book that he came to Brixton and he came to one of my khutbahs, and I wasn't hardcore enough. And so that he left and wouldn't come back and everything. So I took that as a compliment, looking at the extremism that he actually went to in the end. But speaking to that, I think one of the things we need to look at when we're looking at the pace of radicalization. Now, I mentioned that, especially with looking at what happened with social media. But when we go back to the 90s and we saw these individuals like this Morton Storm becoming radicalized, the depth of which they went to actually become inculcated with extremism was a lot deeper than those who are being radicalized now during the ISIS era, during the social media. Many of those who've been radicalized at this particular point now, it's just emotion, and there's a lot of ignorance that's there in that instance. And I want to speak to another area of my PhD, which I highlighted concerning the pace of radicalization, in which I said here, psychological, socio-economic, and religious drivers also form part of the more general mosaic that affect the pace of radicalization towards extremism. Many studies investigating fanaticism suggest that the psychological imbalance is a recurring feature in a number of case studies. Further studies even suggest the existence of a primal trait that enhances the development of fanaticism within an individual. So you do have, there may be triggers or things lying dormant in particular individuals, maybe an emotional imbalance, maybe an intellectual imbalance, maybe something psychological. And that is more what affects, I think, later individuals who become radicalized. And this is arguable, some may disagree, but from the earlier perspectives, when I was examining those who became radicalized during the 90s, it was the ideological distortion that drove them more. They were more knowledge-based, but from a misrepresentation, a misinterpretation, misunderstanding of particular tenets in the religion. So then till now, the pace is a lot quicker now, but also the lack of knowledge and the more emotive response is even more in preponderance today than it was 20, 30 years ago.
I don't know if I'd agree with that premise or not, because I just feel like really the you know, those root causes are really still the same. A lot of people think they have knowledge, and this is the whole thing with misinterpretation. I can think of a particular person in a particular locality which had ulama there, okay, and he was a talib al-ilm. And what was one of the traits he had? He used to always go off by himself and study a lot. He would read in the library. Hey, that's beautiful. Read, research. He's reading major books. And this is the problem we find with a lot of these guys, like the kid in Birmingham, who's reading all kind of huge books way above his level that the scholars don't even discuss. And then he's claiming this and claiming it's okay to revolt. It's okay to make takfir to this one. It's okay to do this one. This particular brother that we knew personally was like that as well. And I've known so many people. They're reading huge books. They're going way above their level. They just learned the Arabic language. And then what happens? They start to grab onto certain things in the religion that are from fatwa, from the people, the early generations, just no context, no real knowledge, no background, no usul. And then they make their own fatwa. Hey, this is Dar al-Harb. Hey, this is okay. This particular brother, I'm not going to mention which country, he tried to rob an armored car. Okay? This is the kind of stuff, and we've seen it, Akhi. You and I, we both lived through that. We've seen so many individuals, you know, and I would honestly say I can't think of any of them, no matter who they were, that were really people who had knowledge like that. Yeah, I
think we're saying the same thing. What I'm saying is it took longer then to get to that stage of radicalization because there was a process of exposure to ilm, but it was more distorted. Now you're jumping on social media, you're moving it a lot quicker, you've got access to books and everything much more quickly. You've got audiences that are, let's say, gassing you up or fueling you in that instance there. So I understand what you're saying. What you're saying is it, but still, when you look at the rate and the pace of radicalization, then and now, it's different. The pace is a lot more quicker. And Sister Shabna, I'll read what she's saying. And many of those leaders radicalizing the youth in the mid-late 90s would encourage them to go out and commit offenses, while those same leaders would never get their hands dirty. Absolutely correct, my sister. And we saw that. We actually knew some of these extremist protagonists. I don't need to name them. You know who they are. And they never got their hands dirty. And I'll give you an example of one thing that happened. One of them, and I will call, people know I'm not shy to mention names. We had an incident where one of our sisters were attacked when I was the chairman of Brixton Mosque. And we raced to the estate that was there. Armed police, everything came. We said, we're not leaving, we're not moving. We actually had to, we dealt with a particular individual who we caught, but we wanted the sister's house protected. And the police came, said, you've got to move. We weren't moving, big standoff. And one of the extremist protagonists came with a small group of these people, okay? Because he wanted to be part of it, okay? Now, when the police surrounded him at this particular point in time, because he was very vocal and everything, and he was standing away from us, they surrounded him, and I saw the fear and apprehension in his face. I was looking at him, and he was looking over at me, not knowing what to say and not knowing what to do. And they were saying, who are you? Who's responsible? Who's in charge? And he didn't know what to say. So when he looked at me, I just nodded. I gave him a sort of nod, and then he quickly pointed to me. He's in charge, to take the heat off him. Sister Shabnan, you've mentioned a very pertinent point. We see that the protagonists of extremism are cowards. There's an element of cowardice. They look for foot soldiers. They look for cannon fodder, while they sit back and espouse and spew this violent extremist terrorist propaganda and rhetoric. And in some instances, I question sometimes, do they completely believe in it themselves? Because they never lead by example in that particular instance. So we see that. And unfortunately, those foot soldiers do have that fervency, do have that distorted and misrepresented understanding of the religion. And they're doing things through overzealousness. You know, we've spoken about the 4 stage, the cognitive stages that I've mentioned before, and they catch them at the early 2 founding and youthful, idealistic and very vulnerable stages of their development. And they target them at that stage because they cannot get them later on in the latter 3 stages, 3rd and 4th stage in that instance. So this is I think this discussion is very, very important. Yes, Sister Shabdan, 100% cowardice in that instance there.
I don't want to oversimplify, though. I don't want to oversimplify. I would love to paint that picture that they're, you know, and I don't think you're saying all of them, obviously. But there are those that they do make those moves. But I agree in general with your premise, you know, that a lot of them, they sit back in the ranks, they recruit and get those guys, you know, and get the youth to go and do their dirty deeds, you know. Yeah.
And remember, she's speaking, Sister Shabna mentioned particularly about the 90s. And I'm speaking about the UK. We were it was the hot seat then in the UK. And we saw that from all of them at that stage in the 90s. Even I was listening to a discussion, they're saying, oh, some went over to Bosnia, and they've made their reputation. I'm not going to mention their names. They've been released and everything now, but we know that they went on. It was a tour guide that they went to Bosnia. They went in. Someone took them around, kept them safe, got a little scared, and they came out. Just like some went to Afghanistan. They went there. I've got individuals who contacted me, said they were crying all the time, saying, "Please get me out of here. Please get me out of here." So for some, this is, I have to say, in the most crass and crude term, edutainment, to garner legitimacy, to garner followings, and to be looked at as the one standing up. Yes, we know there were some who were in the field. We know who they are. We know that they were there in Afghanistan, and that wasn't extremism at that particular time. As we know, there was defensive jihad that was taking place. But the point of the matter now, coming back to that, is that polarization towards violent extremism and terrorism. There's the opposite polarization, and they are both feeding each other. If we want to look at non-religious politics now, and the condition and environment in the US at the moment, your country, where we see the Democrats and the Republicans, and that polarization, liberalism from the Democrats, far-right extremism raising its head amongst the Republicans. So we see that these polarizations exist not only within religious context, not only with socio-religious and socio-economic in that particular instance, like what we're seeing in or socio-cultural, what we're seeing in France at the moment. Those polarizations exist, and when one becomes more vehement, it only fuels the other. And that's why with Islam, this is why we're told by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I have to bring that hadith where he drew the line in the sand, and he drew off each side the offshoots, one being an extreme. Yeah, and I'll let you elaborate on that as a student of knowledge. You are extremely. The lines were drawn on one side, showing a particular polarization of a particular type, and we saw groups of innovation all having particular traits of that inclination. Then on the other side, he showed some other divergences, and he said, this is the straight path. So we are seeing that enacted within a religious context. We're seeing that within societal context in that instance. And it's about knowing how to navigate and traverse the straight path. So on that hadith, Khalid, if you want to elaborate on that, please do.
That was something that was a big part of the focus of my PhD, is talking about the concept of hizbiyah, okay? The concept of partisanship, breaking into groups and the sects, as the Prophet ﷺ has said. You mentioned that hadith, and so many, a very famous hadith, the hadith which is known as hadith al-iftiraq, افترقت اليهود على 71 فرقة إلى آخر hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ said the Jews break into 71 sects, Christians 72 sects, my ummah into 73 sects, all of them in the fire except one. How is it, you could ask, all of them in the fire, meaning even from my ummah in the fire? So the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, they said, who are they, Ya Rasulullah? Meaning, who are the saved ones? Who are the ones who are going to not enter the fire? He said, those who are upon what I'm upon and what my Sahaba are upon, radiallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'in. So that is clear. What something that came on, guys, let's focus on the topic. This is the topic. So this something that came into mind before we came on, this aspect of hizbiyah. And as you mentioned, the partisan politics. So there is, and this is one of the things I talked about, the pluralism within Islam. Ahl Sunnah rejects that. We don't say it's okay to be in this group and to do this practice and do this practice. These are aberrations in Islam to orthodoxy. Likewise, as you mentioned, the partisanship of the Republicans and the Democrats, for example. I mean, how people, it's an ideology. What I was thinking about before this podcast, I was like, subhanAllah, I said, this is another reason why Muslims, you can see why they should not, or they should do their best to avoid these type of politics in the West. We know some of our scholars have said, of course, it's been built on the masalih and the mufasid, the harms and the benefits as far as voting, as far as things like this, because I'm getting a lot of questions about this. And this is why we need the major scholars to study these masail and study the context as a society. Because what happens, let's say if right now you have a student of knowledge or a da'i or someone saying, yeah, it's okay, vote for Biden to remove Trump because Trump is producing that Islamophobia, producing the hostility and the breaking, okay? You say it's okay. But the Muslims are so divided in Aqidah, so this is where it all comes, and so divided into groups and so forth, you will find those who will say no. Everyone's going to determine their own maslahah. So there's going to be a group that is still going to vote for Trump. They're going to say, we're Muslims for Trump because he has more agreements with our conservative values. There'll be another group that say, no, Biden is more beneficial because we had more freedoms and the politics were less hostile and aggressive. So I was thinking about that before we came on, and that's another mafasid or another harm of trying to vote, because we don't have unified leadership in the Muslim in the non-Muslim countries. So for the Muslims in France, they can't say, hey, we've got an alternative to Macron in his policy. They're not unified. They don't have anybody with orthodoxy and who really unifies all of them and can speak for them to say, hey, this is who the Muslims should vote for. So they're, even how our scholars who made fatwa for this, they were looking at this from one way of looking at this, but there's other elements that the Muslims they don't even share the same political ideology. We have some that are march with the LGBTQ community or TQ. I'm never gonna get. I tried to memorize it before the podcast. I did. I sat and I anyhow. So you have those who are going to say no, that's okay. So they're going to go to that liberalist extreme. They're going to put money into the Democratic Party and try to incur favors to hold their position. There's another group going to say no, they're even further from us. So you see those same partisan politics affects the Muslims internally and externally. And this also, how does this relate to our overall topic? Well, because we opened the door of how this partisanship and this fanaticism to various groups and sects and ideologues, how that can lead to the extremism, and how that is a part of this whole system and this cycle of, the regime hammering down on the people and the people then becoming marginalized and extremism erupting. So, there's a connectedness. I might not have made that connection very clear.
No, I think you did. No, you did. I think you did, but and I think Sister Amelia, she may be speaking because this group, they usually converse amongst each other. So I think she's speaking to others in the group who may be having a discussion behind the scenes. That's why she says to focus on the topic, inshallah. That's what I understood from that. But no, I think that you're right. The context that you've actually given, and I think it's very interesting that you've spoken about how disunited we are in the West. Even if we were looking at socio-political aspects, as you said, Muslims for Trump, Muslims for Biden. I've even seen it when we had the elections in the UK, and I saw Muslims saying, "I'm joining the Labour Party. We've got to vote for Corbyn." At the time, and the disaster that was, and other Muslims say, "No, the conservative values of the Conservative Party." In that instance, but again, I think the most important thing we need to look at as we conclude this particular podcast, we can go on, is the assimilation premise of the French government that is really fueling this polarization and this ideological premise on which they want people to be. And I think Sister Shabnan put something up.
Yeah.
Do you want to read that, Khalid? And then we can start.
But neither Trump or Biden will stop bombing Muslim lands, so that should be a point of reflection for Muslims about the fractured state of the Ummah itself. Naam, that's true. I think the point is with those voting fatwa, as Imam al-Albani, Imam Wasiullah Abbas, and others, and I think Imam Abdul Muhsin al-Abad and other than them, were mentioning in a specific context, not saying it's permissible, but saying it is the akhaf dararain. It's the lesser of the two evils. Okay, so then you're looking at that's one element, as you said, the bombing. But perhaps as American Muslims, we're more concerned about who's going to in our daily lives, who's going to be shooting at us more than what happens in Afghanistan. So all of these things make up that the complexity of politics and so forth. But I think the issue here is looking at the lesser of the two evils. This is what the scholars are really talking about. They're saying, hey, they're both evil. It's an evil process, everything, but you are there. What is going to be in your best interest? Prior to Trump, with the advent of Trump, we had received so many more on the ground in America, so many more attacks against Muslims on the streets, sisters being threatened with, guys, rednecks coming up with their pistols and their shotguns, trailing sisters, coming up like he's a police officer with the gun up to the window, really not speaking. Others in Walmart, women and people. Even there was the case, I remember Anwar Wright, one of the du'at in Philly, who put on his social media and he was being threatened and challenged in a restaurant, and he's with his family. So these kind of things have increased. So my view in that would be that, hey, during Biden and that liberalism, there's when that is there's more safety for us in America as American Muslims. What does that mean for the Uyghurs? What does that mean for other situations? We don't know. But how does that mean? Is there's an increase in drone strikes in Yemen? I don't know. But this is the nature of the partisanship as well, and the politics, and looking out for interests and vying for a place in a pluralistic society and in a pluralistic atmosphere.
I think, no, Jazakallah khair for that, Khalid. And I think what our sisters and brothers have contributed has been amazing in this particular episode. What I think we can conclude on is it's very clear that when you have governments with political parties, like we see in France, pushing their political agenda, enforcing it on Muslims, and basically saying, as you said, we are shutting you down. And they've got to look at the kickback that is going to be inevitable.
Yeah.
It will invariably come, because we've studied this, not just us, but we're studying it as socially conservative Muslims, Salafi Muslims in this instance, because it's impacted upon us and the wider Muslim populace in general. And it needs those to be able to speak to that and articulate in the manner that we've articulated it, not from an emotive perspective solely, but from an academic, intellectual perspective. So those non-Muslims who are listening will see this has been studied. This is what's happening. We've spoken historically at the moment. We've spoken about contemporary effects. And we're not only talking about now. Allah, of course, knows the unseen in the future. But based on these frameworks and discussions and what we've studied, this polarization is going to continue to enact or cause terrorist attacks. It's going to continue as a result to cause a shutdown of civil liberties and values, specifically against the Muslims, but by default, it's going to affect wider society. And something different has to be done by one of the parties or one of the elements, and that must be surely those in power, those who hold the keys to government and society. And until they change that, they can say what they like about assimilation, what should be the priority and everything like that. We are in a post-colonial era. That era will never return, where you can take control of minds, bodies, souls, even if you break them, as we saw the last 400 or 500 years with transatlantic slavery. So they need to come up with a different blueprint, a different plan, so that we don't have this perpetual cycle of two extremes. Because we as a Muslim, as the sister said, Dina wasat, ummatun wasat, as we've been told in Surah Al-Baqarah, ayat 143. And we conclude on that, Khalid, if you're happy to, that we need to, in spite of everything that's happening, we do need to understand and know what our deen says about being wasat, and we need to cling on to those with our molar teeth if we need to, and we need to articulate that verbally, and we need to articulate that in our manners and our behavior.
Jazakallah khairan, Allah yubarak fikum. I do need to say something.
Please.
So I don't know if it's necessary, if it's, I don't believe that it's necessarily true that it cannot happen again. I do believe it can.
That's what I'm saying. It can.
Huh?
Oh, you mean about, no, me personally? No, not on that scale.
Yeah.
Not on that scale.
Because listen, it's so powerful how these things, how enslavement, how dominance, how colonialism, how sly and nationalism and so forth, because we see those elements there. Basically, all France has to do, for example, in the French case, as we're talking about. So they've already laid down the hammer, and they're going to start hammering more. If any small event, the smallest thing someone does right now as a Muslim, is going to be exploited, and all it gives us is more. They can come out with 2, 3, 4 hammers and basically say, hey, no longer, for the sake of national cohesion, for the sake of the security of the republic, we cannot no longer allow praying in the Islamic centers. Because until we can deal with this extremist threat, this is not targeting your community, but we need to deal with this extremist threat. Then they just need to take it a little step further. It's very easy, and still all under the guise of liberty and democracy. And that's what we see. Things that we see in America, just going through the airports and stuff, are things we couldn't have imagined so many years ago. Like, no way, it's never going to happen like that. No, never, never. That's the norm, and we're all used to it now.
That's physical, Khalid. What you're saying, I hear what you're saying. That's physical restraint and securitization. But the Muslims will not allow, I believe this, I believe it's there from the deen, they will not allow that to happen to our minds and our hearts.
I don't think that's true. I think as far as the masses, I say like the Prophet ﷺ said, "La tazal ta'ifatun min ummati zahirin al haqq." There won't cease to be a group from my nation. A group from who? My nation. Meaning the nation is bigger, and it's just a group. Zahirin al haqq, that continues to be on the truth. Okay, so there will be some, yes, but I think it's very easy for the masses because. As there was a beautiful piece of poetry, it was by the Last Poets. You're familiar with the Last Poets?
Yes, mashallah. Okay.
And they had one of their lines, they said, "It's already been done yet." They were talking about how African Americans were already conquered, by the society. They didn't need to do anything else. We already got your mind, as a lot of their poetry was talking about. And it's the same thing. They've already got the minds of so many people. So many people, it's already done yet, as they said. It's already been done yet. Okay? It's already there. So all it takes is a little bit more. I mean, you've got major institutions in America, in the West, propagating this progressive stuff, which totally allows it and totally opens the door to totally conquering the mind. If you make people ignorant of their Aqidah, and this is why Ahl Sunnah is so vigilant about Aqidah. People get tired. I don't want to hear Tawheed anymore. I don't want to hear this. You Salafis and you are talking about this. Well, no, you need this. This Aqidah, this is your creed. The way you believe is the most powerful tool for defending you against doubt and all of this evil. Because when you think about the colonial, how was Britain able to, through the Indian Tea Company? I forget the British. When they had colonized India.
Yeah.
300 years.
I think it's the railroads. Yeah.
So
Right.
They had a company, and I forgot what the name of the company. Most of the time, the administration in that company was literally, I don't even think it was 100 people. It was just so few in numbers. And you've got millions of people colonized, going under your regime because they had their minds.
And that's why, Khalid, I think we'll come somewhere in the middle. Maybe me who talks against idealism, maybe I'm being idealistic. Yeah. I just don't believe, looking at, I don't want to use that term, but how woke the younger generation of some of the Muslims are. Even looking at some of the, it can happen, as you're saying, to that extent. Will it happen to that extent? I have optimism in what I'm seeing in the world today. 30 years a Muslim, mashallah, that will not happen. But also there's the difficult thing though that we have. While that my hearts and minds drive is taking place on the liberal side, there's the violent extremists, takfiri, stoking and poking and prodding, saying, look, you see, and this pendulum swing. That's the worry. And as you said, being in the middle and the pendulum sticking and being stuck in the middle, that's where the challenge and the problem is. And as Sister Shama, wa alaikum salam, Sister Shama, good to see you here, I said, the hadith comes up again. It's like holding on to hot coals, holding on to our religion. It's like holding on to hot coals at the moment. And I think one of the things I love about this show, brothers and sisters who are listening, Dr. Khalid and myself, we are on the same thing in how we believe, but we do occasionally disagree on some elements, and I think it's a healthy disagreement, but not in the sense of, okay, it's polarized, it's on solutions, it's on particular context and everything. So I respect that, Dr. Khalid, Brother Khalid. I really respect that, and I respect the audience for the input. I think, do you want the last words, Brother Khalid, as we can conclude, inshallah?
For tiny things. One thing, someone asked about hijrah, because this is relevant to this. Okay?
That's reactionary.
Something about where do we go for hijrah? Very nice podcast. I didn't agree with all the tafsilat, but the brother Abdurrahman Hassan did something about hijrah, was very powerful. You can't really say a lot. I don't agree with his conclusions, some of his conclusions and some of those things, but that's, neither here nor there. We want it to be the disagreement based on ilm. Tayyib. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Innama a'malu binniyat." Verily, actions are tied to the intention. So, as long as you have the intention to make hijrah somewhere, you have the intention, you're going to get that reward of it. Like you have a literal intention to. when you live in a place like France, Belgium, and some of those places that are very aggressive and very pro-secular and pro assimilationist or assimilate, whatever you want to say, that those kind of things are aggressively pushing you out of the society. Okay, those kind of those places, perhaps you definitely want to consider real in a in a very realistic way and be very serious about making hijrah to some places. Many of our listeners, they come from Muslim backgrounds, from Pakistan, from India, from various countries. You generally have a place to go. We, myself and Dr. Baker, we don't have those same kind of ties, but still the earth is wasia, and you're going to be rewarded for it if you make that intent. I'm just saying for those, I believe it is something which is recommended. In certain situations, it's going to be wajib. And I think probably France and those places are, along those best about that. But again, we leave that for the ulama. So that's something I just want to point out. There's a million other things I'd love to say, but I think we'll probably leave it there to keep it brief and not bore the people.
And Viva l'Islam, mashallah, to our sisters are saying, instead of Viva la France. Yes, Viva l'Islam, mashallah, tabarakallah. And again, no, Khalid, Jazakallah khair for a very engaging session. I hope that our viewers and increased viewers, mashallah, tabarakallah, Shama, Jazakallah khair for your very complimentary words, and all of you, mashallah. I hope that everyone has benefited from this. We will continue to look at contemporary issues, discuss our PhD and academic studies, and compare them to others in an effort to share what we have studied with you, to share that with you, and also to show how we've looked at and would tackle from an academic perspective and religious perspective, inshallah, these challenges, inshallah. So we have a discernible context and template, the deen being the primary one on the Sunnah, mashallah, in which to traverse these very, very choppy, stormy societal waters, wherever we may be living in this particular age. Jordan, again, Jazakallah khair for you sharing up your time and your colleagues with us. We really appreciate this, and we look forward to seeing you. Remember, this show is fortnightly, and some may ask why. It does take preparation when we're looking back at our PhDs and we're researching and we're looking at things that we can bring in with our PhD studies and everything. So sometimes that takes time to bring together, and we want to make sure that what we're giving to you is of a qualitative and highly intellectual level, as you all deserve, inshallah. So I will say Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh until a fortnight in this show. I'm here on Saturday again with Abdul Rahim Green, Piece of Cake, as you know, and on Mondays. And inshallah, we hope that we'll be seeing Dr. Khalid more frequently, but he does have his own shows. Look up his channel, YouTube, and he's giving nice little trinkets, I like to call them, and gems that he's sharing. So we are being as active as we can, and we first and foremost are hoping that Allah accepts this from us, inshallah. And Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.